Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This edition to Insider's Guide to Energy is brought to you by Fidectis. Go to www.fidectis.com for more information.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Johan Oberg. Johan, what's happening?
Hi, Chris. Good to be back. Another week. Unfortunately, with a little bit of a cold. So it's not the whiskey from the weekend. It's actually a cold, but hopefully it gets through what I'm saying.
I think whiskey actually helps a cold. It clears you out. So I think maybe the prescription is a little bit of whiskey and you'll be better, but I am no doctor, so don't necessarily take my advice.
No, but it's like the internet advice. I'll take that one. No problem. You choose your advice. So how are things?
Things are going well. It's a busy time. We just have the COP conference going on, all kinds of press going on about saving the world and what we're doing with renewables and great energy. So very interesting time to be in the energy business, to be honest with you. It's been pretty exciting.
No, for sure. I think it's been a week or a week and a half of massive news releases, some really, really interesting news. I just read a report from Volvo coming out about charging infrastructure and how that is regarding sustainability. Quite interesting, where they're actually reaching out to world leaders and energy companies to help them. But maybe more interesting regarding our talk today is the growth also on EV and the investments or the partnership between Tesla and Hertz. I'm not sure if you read it, but they ordered.
I did not read that one.
Hertz just ordered 100,000 Model 3 from Tesla, which is, I wouldn't mind being the sales rep, getting that order.
So, yeah, I wonder when they'll get them. So my best friend just ordered an S series, and he told me he had to pay for it. He ordered it in North America. I think he had to pay for it now for a June delivery. And it's a pretty healthy check you pay for it because you get it at that price point. There's no, in the North American market, anything over $60,000. You get no bonuses for it. So he's buying this car. He did tell me that Tesla used to do some kind of interesting thing where they would turn off half the battery power to get the price down to under 60,000 and then come and charge you to buy the capacity of your batteries later, which brought the car up to full value. I don't know if that's folklore, if that really happened, but that's kind of an interesting way to skirt that.
I think there are so many rumors, so many things. I just thought the actual deal was quite interesting. We heard about the Rivian and Amazon earlier this year about trucks, and now Hertz. I think it's a great sign for e-mobility, if not the last.
Well, I mean, we're doing another show on e-mobility, so obviously you and I are interested in it, or we wouldn't invite these guests to be on the podcast for our audience. It'd be interesting today to find out what's going on, because I know when I did a pre-show with this guest, my experience with EVs was mostly through Tesla, coming from North America before I moved to Europe a few years ago. And I had a number of employees that had them, and, knowing where the superchargers were, knowing where the network was and all that. And, Tesla was early in North America. I think they had a network through Walmart parking lots or something like that, where you could, get cross country, not very conveniently, but you could actually, even before the network was really built, get around the country in a Tesla. But if you bought a different EV, it was a slightly different story of finding charging stations or finding one working and things like that. So it'd be interesting, as fleets are moving to EVs and corporate accounts and things like that, what the value our guest brings to do this, and how you can do that, maybe help things be more green perhaps than they are today as well.
No, I agree. And I think if you kind of look at the EV industry in general, you look at the car manufacturers, the OEM, you got the energy company obviously producing the energy, but then probably the more interesting and the more complex is the infrastructure. How does this work in terms of doing? You mentioned Tesla as a start. We saw the CEO of Volkswagen coming out complaining about his Ionity company just recently as well, that they're not fast and good enough. So this whole thing around charging it's also the kind of the stumbling block for a lot of new buyers of EVs, of how do I charge, etc. So I think it's going to be
But
really interesting. I got
did
loads
you
of
see that
questions.
the Porsche came out that's doing wireless charging now, 80% charge in like 10 minutes or something ridiculous? It was pretty impressive. So I mean, the technology is moving quickly.
Oh, for sure.
But rather than you and I having a show, why don't we have a show with the guests that we invited? So we've invited Niall Riddell. Neil, welcome to the program.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
So Neil, you're the CEO and founder of a company. Maybe you can tell us the name of your company and what you do.
Hey guys, so the company that we founded is called Paua, and we're helping people find power everywhere. We're simplifying public electric vehicle charging. So we're a climate tech company based on some fintech solutions enabling smart, connected charging infrastructure in the built environment to better serve fleets of electric vehicles. And a lot of this is based around the problems and the pain points that drivers feel as they enter this ecosystem. And you've just touched on 2 or 3 of the lovely pain points, plus the solutions that are starting to emerge from the leaders in this space.
Okay, so in the pre-call, I think my colleague said that he was going to ask the dumb question. So you gave us a mouthful. It was very. Can you explain your company? Maybe if I was like in 2nd grade, what is it you guys do without such a complex explanation?
So we make it easier to charge. And what I mean by that is when you pick up your first electric vehicle and you step out the door, you kind of expect it to be a bit like a petrol or diesel experience. And with a petrol or diesel car, you drive off down the road, you look for a red and yellow sign, a green and yellow sign, you pull over, you put a nozzle in your vehicle, it's petrol or diesel, it fills up the tank. A couple of minutes later, you step into a kiosk, you pull out your credit card, you pay for your experience, you take your paper receipt away from you, and off you go, you hit the highway again. But with electric, it's fundamentally different. You've got to find these charge points there, like you described there, like tucked away behind some supermarket somewhere or in the corner of a car park. You've got to know when you turn up whether that charge point actually works with your vehicle. There's multiple different connectors. They charge at different speeds. You could get a charge in 20 minutes or you could get a charge in 4 hours. And if you do turn up, you kind of want to know that that charge point is working and you want to know there's no one else using it at the time. Even once you've got to that point, you've still got to get the thing to turn on. So you've got to find some way of authenticating, demonstrate that you can pay for this charge event. Once you run the charge event, you've then got to try and, if you're a business driver, you've got to find a way to get a receipt out of that machine or that system. And that receipt enables you to claim that money back off your business. So we're trying to take that rather cumbersome and clunky experience, which turns people off when they look at electric vehicle charging, and make it into something which is much more seamless and enables you to jump in the car, find the charge point from the car or from your phone. You find that solution, you turn up, you start the charge, you end the charge, and you get back on the road. Because at the end of the day, whilst I like technology, most other people find this a little bit of a bore.
So, question. So if I look at my life, so I work in the commercial side of a business. I'm out visiting customers all the time. So I might be in my car, I might drive across Germany, I might drive across Switzerland or Austria. If I were doing this and I used a tool like Google Maps, would you help me figure out, my day, like where I'm going to end up at the charge point? Or is this just when my car is empty? Like, so am I planning my trip? So I'm going from here, I don't know, Munich, and I want to drive there on an EV. Is this front end information I need to figure out, or is this information I figure out in real time?
The experience of drivers is quite often based on a real-time experience. We are still quite early in the deployment of the infrastructure required to charge these cars. So with the exception of a handful of really forward-thinking businesses, a lot of these charge points are single chargers and single locations. So if you turn up, find that one charger is occupied, you're going to kind of move on because you don't want to wait the 30 to 45 minutes. So you really need that real-time data. Where this starts to change is companies like Fastned, who are fast approaching a European coverage, the guys at Ionity, who are building out multi-chargers at each location at high powers. And this kind of gives you much more of that petrol station experience. But even then, we're talking about sort of like long-distance routing. If you then go to the world of someone who maybe doesn't have home charge points, they can then, find the space to charge outside their house. So they've got a street charger to enable them to charge. Equally, they need to know that that's available and that will service their charging needs at that time.
So The way I understand it is that I like your analogy where you compared it to the old world, so to speak, where you go and you fill up your petrol, you know where to go. It's big signs. You can get a hot dog. It's 2 minutes and you're out. But that's an infrastructure that has in parallel been built with the OEM industry. Whereas now we're looking more of an extremely complex ecosystem of energy providers, payment solutions. Some are not talking to others, etc. So where do you see for yourself versus, for example, a high speed charging network like Ionity? Is that if I'm a car driver, can I only use one of them? Am I restricted to kind of one? How does this work?
So the vision and the dream is that it becomes more and more seamless. But the starting point for this has to be with a small number of networks. So our partners today are primarily UK-based businesses or UK-based networks who we aggregate together into one solution. So rather than just going, I'm charging on Ionity, you can know that you can charge on Ionity and you can charge on Osprey and you can charge on Fastned, but you have the same digital experience each time and the same ability to get that bill back to you. You get that bill back to the fleet manager, most crucially. So, this is really targeted at helping businesses get their fleets on the road. So we're trying to make it easier and easier for people to adopt public electric vehicle charging as part of their strategy and remove another barrier enabling them to adopt electric to replace their petrol and diesel fleets.
So I guess in your world, if I understand it correctly, and I did some of the research from your website as well, it's more directed then to fleet managers and fleet owners. So how does that turns in terms of? I always come back to the commercial parts of this one where we talked about the ownership of the customer. So in this case, someone owns that customer. Someone is that interface with the customer that manage that payment solutions. The rest comes sometimes in the telco world we call the bit pipe. So how does that sit? Who owns the customer? Who am I as the fleet manager? Who do I speak to?
So this is an area which gets quite contentious quite quickly because everybody wants to own the customer. So if I was to be building this solution for a domestic customer base, an individual customer base, quite a lot of these charge point operators get a little bit defensive about the fact that I'm sitting between them and the end customer. So what I'm trying to do here is really service a particular market segment, and the service we're actually providing is fundamentally quite boring. We're aggregating bills. We're an accountancy team as much as anything, and we're enabling the management of a tax position and an accounting process rather than actually owning customers. However, you do look at the space generally and go, how does that dynamic, that relationship between the customer and the interface they're using to get electricity change? And you can imagine a future where public electric vehicle charging or all electric vehicle charging is just big plugs. At the end of the day, when you turn up at a petrol station, it's just a big pump. The relationship you have with that, that guy in the kiosk is pretty limited. It's pretty much to handing over that payment card, which is similar to the payment solutions we're putting in place to enable, payment to occur, because we do need the payment to occur. But we're trying to aggregate that complex landscape together of charge points with different providers, different experiences, different buttons to press, different cars to work with to enable it to be more and more seamless. It's a lot of this transition enables us to adopt the technology that's emerging and try and stitch it together in a way that the consumer has a better experience.
So what I'm hearing you say is that you basically provide ease for the customer for billing, right? So I can go to any network, and eventually we hopefully get away kind of like they did in Europe with smartphones, where we're not going to have lightning connectors, we're not going to have different type of connectors on our phones. We're going to have a kind of universal connector for whatever EV I'm driving. Now, one thing that comes to mind as you were speaking is early on the podcast we talked to someone at Daimler and their e-mobility group, and he had a very interesting point from his perspective, saying, look, the large car companies have great relationships. They got a financing wing. They have credit. They have the car. They know where you're going. They know everything about you, basically. And so I think that some of the car companies are also working the angle of keeping that customer, to Johan's point, right? Because they realize that with the e-mobility, your car is basically riding around in a computer with all kinds of data about you and access to you and all kinds of valuable stuff. Are you crossing that as well? Are you working with like the Daimlers of the world or companies like that? Are you providing a service for them as they try to maintain their customer, and then you kind of become their billing arm, or how's that working?
It's quite an interesting observation. I used to work in an electricity utility, and we had the opportunity to spend some time with some executives from Honda. And Honda came over and said, we're kind of jealous of the experience that you as electricity suppliers have with your customer, because you get to bill them at least 4 times a year. We only see our customers once a year when they come in for service and maintenance. So your customer engagement is so much higher than ours. And he was right. But, these automotive guys don't have a lot of customer engagement. People buy a vehicle, the badge is on the vehicle, the badge is in front of them when they sit there in that vehicle every day. But the engagement between the driver and the automotive companies is limited until you look at the rise of where some of this modern technology is going. I drive a Renault Zoe. It's a little electric car. It buzzes around quite nicely, but it's connected to the internet permanently. The OEMs will know where my car is. They'll know the state of charge of my battery. They'll know how often I charge. They can probably work out where I live, even if I haven't told them. So there's a whole ecosystem of connected car data emerging that these automotive companies have access to. And the question that we should almost be asking as drivers ourselves is, what are they going to do with it? How are they going to create value for me? Because it's one thing them having my data, but I want to know how I benefit from that. So what is the use case that these automotive companies can develop? And one of the areas we've been investigating is, how do we take some of that data from these automotive partners that we're working with and convert it into something of value for the end customer? So a good case study in this example would be something like fraud management. We can tell exactly which car is charging and exactly what charge point they're charging on, and therefore we can validate for that fleet manager that the right car is charging in the right place at the right time. And those sort of simple use cases are the kind of areas where we can add value to that connected ecosystem that the automotive manufacturers are investing in currently.
So, switching a little bit on the topic, but staying with that fleet manager and that kind of the billing cycle, which I thought was quite interesting. You're building your software or your service on top on a number of charging stations. We know from at least historically that prices is not like you drive into a gas station, it's approximately the same price. Here it could shift a fair bit depending on where you charge, which must be a slight nightmare for a fleet manager, where how do you control this if they fill up the EV expensively every single time or not? So how do we address this? Because that's something I really don't understand in terms of the charging of each charging instant.
That's a really interesting observation, Johan, because I'm going to flip it totally on its head and say you got it back to front. These fleet managers get a weekly price for their bunkered fuel, for how much their diesel is going to cost them. And every week that price changes. And they can then, look at the week ahead and go, right, this is how much it will cost me to freight goods from A to B or deliver parcels from C to D. Whereas with electricity, particularly on the public charging networks, those prices are pretty much flat all the time. So the idea of having a dynamic price in the public charging ecosystem hasn't really started to emerge yet. Tesla, I know, play with it. They've got a little bit of surge pricing. When you get a lot of people using a particular supercharger location, they'll rise the prices, which means from the consumer perspective, you never quite know what you're paying, exactly as you described. But if you go and charge on a Fastned charger in the UK, it will cost you 39 pence a kilowatt hour. That's on a Monday, a Sunday, a morning, an evening, in the winter, in the summer. And they might change that price every 6 to 12 months, but you've pretty much got a fixed price. Where it does change is in the home. If you are, allowing your drivers, your fleet drivers, to charge at home, then you're going to see different prices in every single one of those drivers' homes. They're going to be on different energy tariffs. It's probably not fair to ask them to change all to the same tariff, but the home ecosystem then becomes quite complex to manage. And a number of the fleet managers we're speaking to currently have, raised the fact that the home ecosystem and how to manage home charging for the drivers is actually a bit of a headache, because they've got to make sure they compensate appropriately for the charging that takes place. So it's the home that they see the variance in, whereas in the public domain, it's pretty much a flat price.
But that's quite interesting, because I read a survey that I think that you initiated in terms of public charging for fleet, and it's still a low adoption of public charging still on the fleet, which kind of I wouldn't say contradicts, but then creates a little bit of a challenge if the majority is actually charging from home.
Yeah, it's a great piece of research that we had conducted for us by the guys at 360 Media. We wanted to understand why and what it was that was really driving fleets to use, or in this case, not use public charging. So the survey identified that 40% of fleet managers, and there were about 200 fleet managers surveyed, 40% of them were not using public charging. And the second and the follow-up question that we asked was, would you use public charging if we were able to provide you with a single experience and a single bill? And the answer that came back was yes. So it seems that the complexity associated with having, in the UK, there's 75 network operators. That means 75 different experiences, possibly more. It means 75 apps or memberships or subscriptions. It means that you've then got to contact 75 different people to get 75 different receipts. So before you know it, you've got a complex and disaggregated ecosystem. If you take that and multiply it across Europe, you've got hundreds of charge point networks. So before you know it, this access problem, this experience problem, and this ability to get a single bill becomes a bit of a headache. And if you take those fleet managers on the journey, they go, hey, can I put chargers in my depot? Because I can control that. That's my space. It's my car park. The second thing they look at is, who of their fleet has a car parking space at home, can put chargers at home. And latterly, they come to this decision that actually public charging probably needs to be part of their long-term plan. And what we're trying to do is make it so easy that they go, actually, public charging is something we can do today. We get one bill, we know how to manage it, and we can, have a standardized experience for the drivers.
So for public charging to work, do you schedule the time? So you said, is it working? Is it not working? Is it available? So, I'm 10 minutes out from a potential place to have fuel, or I'm a couple minutes a block away. Do I know the pump, the equivalent of the pump's available, right? The connection's available. And how does that work with your platform?
So this is another case study of where Tesla's got it absolutely spot on. The Tesla vehicle has that massive display in it, and you can see, real time where you're going to charge, the state of charge of your vehicle. It can navigate you to the location. And then, there's even clever stuff going on in the background, like as you approach that location, the Tesla starts to warm the battery up to the right temperature to receive the maximum or the best charge it can get at those chargers. So there's some, really genius tech going on in there. And the reason Tesla's done that so well is because they've got this vertical ecosystem where they control the end-to-end driver experience. The reality is, for the rest of us, you've got different cars, different manufacturers of charge points, different providers of services in that ecosystem, and that experience isn't harmonized. So today, you're kind of stuck with your mobile phone. My view is, in the future, we'll see more and more of this data being available inside the car. But right this moment, you're stuck with your mobile phone, and you check your phone perhaps before you set off, perhaps when you're 5 or 10 minutes away, clearly not using your phone while you're driving. But you can then turn up and charge when you get there. Booking, as you kind of referenced there, is actually a really tricky ecosystem for charge points. And for your listeners who aren't electric vehicle drivers, you might pull into a car park, and I like to tell this story. You pull into a car park and you see two big white boxes. Now that means you've got one location, the car park, with what a consumer would consider to be two charge points, two big white boxes. Each of those big white boxes has two EVSEs inside it, so two bits of supply equipment. So that means a total of 4 cars could be charged at one time. But on those machines, they have probably 3 connectors on each of them. So you suddenly turn up and you've got a location with 6 connectors, 4 potential charging opportunities, 2 charging units in one location. And those units have a little digital screen on them. It's maybe 12 inches at best. And it can't tell you a huge amount of information. So if someone has reserved that, you don't find out until you try and plug it into your car and it just doesn't work. So the idea of having booking bays is great, but there's quite a long way to go to really ensure that the consumer experience, when they pull into that car parking spot and think they're going to get a charge, is much better than it is today.
So when I look at your ecosystem and the charging stations that you mentioned, if that is this car park where they set it up, we've been discussing this on some of the shows before, and we see that a lot of the technology now, especially from a data point of view and a business point of view, is driven more towards this kind of a sharing or the platform economy. Look at Uber, look at Airbnb. So with your app and your opportunity then to have this kind of single opportunity to charge wherever it is, it's the same kind of interface, the customer experience is the same. Are you also looking then to expand to almost build an Airbnb of charging, which basically I can throw out a cord from my window to someone to charge at my parking lot in the day. I get the money. This is, for me, this looks like a great opportunity, but I'm very optimistic in terms of how we can share certain things.
Yeah, no, the idea of sharing your charge point at home is something that a few others have explored. It introduces a slightly different layer of complexity because how comfortable do you feel with someone pulling up on your driveway and charging at your house? So it's probably not for everybody, but that's the same as Airbnb. How comfortable do you feel with some stranger in your back bedroom? So there's an ecosystem in here which is probably suitable for some. We're more likely to partner with one of the companies who's accessing that ecosystem. There's some companies doing some really clever stuff, creating that sort of Airbnb of charging. So here in the UK, companies like CoCharger and JustPark, Monta, who are a Danish startup, are starting to look at this ecosystem as well. How do you enable your sharing of your charge point? It's an asset, a piece of infrastructure that can be shared with others. And that becomes more of a shared economy, which is quite a nice story to be able to add to the ecosystem, and particularly at this early stage when we're still learning who is going to adopt what technology.
And then on the flip side of the smaller kind of in-home charging things, I assume that also the incumbent big oil producers, the big gas stations of the world today is also looking at this and probably need your services as well, because if the cars are changing, they need to offer something else.
Yeah, so the some of the more forward-looking gas and petrol station operators who have access and facilities on their forecourts to add electric vehicle charging are doing exactly that. So we're seeing the likes of BP and Shell pushing out charging infrastructure on the forecourt. Clearly, there's some complexity because electricity and petrol don't mix particularly well. So you've got to make sure these are spaces where you can physically separate the site. But then you can see these guys are also accessing the ecosystem, without the petrol and diesel. Shell have got now a number of locations across the UK where there's no petrol or diesel. The acquisition by Shell of New Motion back in the past, BP of ChargeMaster, there's a number of activities going on in this space that is showing that the oil guys are really sat up and are listening and they're paying attention. And I sometimes describe this ecosystem as the alignment of large oil co, large electricity utility. The electricity guys feel like they've got a God-given right to sell electricity to these electric vehicle drivers. The oil companies are selling them, fuel today. And then you've got the automotive guys who we talked about earlier, who are looking to own that customer relationship. And buzzing around in the middle, you've got all of these innovative little startups trying to build new ecosystems, new solutions, make it simpler. So it's quite an exciting space currently.
So, yeah, I mean, I've had great work since the podcast began. BP it does all kinds of interesting things. It's always interesting to talk to an oil major and see all the innovation coming, and I've had great experience talking to them. What I kind of wonder, though, based on the conversation, especially with the conference just going on, so not all electrons are created the same. So how does renewable and sustainable energy, just because you're using electricity, doesn't mean that you're being sustainable? So how does this weigh in?
Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? My own background, I did a bit of work with the Committee on Climate Change here in the UK, writing carbon budgets back in 2007, 2008. And the observation we made at the time was we need to first decarbonise electricity before we can start to electrify parts of the economy to enable them to in turn become decarbonised. And the reality is that many countries are at different stages on their journey in terms of the carbon intensity of their grid. And the UK, we've done a huge amount bringing down emissions intensity. And there was a good friend of mine who picked me up on the fact that transport became the biggest emitter a number of years ago because the UK energy sector had done so much to reduce its emissions. And that was primarily the closure of the big old coal stations. So, firstly, the whole economy as a whole needs to decarbonise. But what's really interesting is of all the partners we've been working with in the charge point operator space, it's almost a de facto standard now that if you're going to run a public charging network, the first thing you do is you secure a supply of renewable electricity. If you are a homeowner and you adopt your first electric vehicle, and during my time at EDF Energy, which was one of my prior roles, we were building solutions for residential consumers. And every time we sold an electric vehicle to someone, they would firstly increase their consumption by about 60%. So from an electricity supplier's perspective, this was excellent, 60% increase in consumption. The second thing they do is notice the price had gone up, so they'd go look for the best deal they could get. But when they went to look for that new deal, they would always look for a green deal. They were looking for something renewable, something that was low carbon, something that could support their transition and their decision to purchase an electric vehicle. So there's almost like an inherent piece in the market currently whereby when people adopt electric vehicles, they want to support it with renewable power. It's something they learn about on that journey, is that education step as they purchase that new vehicle.
So does your app or your API, is that a consideration for some of the data that you get?
So we set out early on with the view that we were going to do this carbon reporting and help fleets understand the emissions intensity of their fleets when they were public charging. Until we realised that pretty much all of the partners we were working with had zero emissions electricity. So it's really not that helpful to be able to tell someone that they've got a net zero emissions supply of electricity coming to their vehicles. What is interesting, and is a little bit more complex, but it is something that your listeners will find really interesting, is that the marginal impact of each of those charge events does actually have an impact on the electricity system. So do you need to then consider not just the supply of electricity that's being provided to that charge point, but the impact that additional 15 kilowatts of power you're adding to the system is having by forcing some power station somewhere to turn up fractionally to deliver that service to your vehicle. And this is us getting into a much more subtle area around carbon reporting, and one which I don't think many are paying attention to yet, but it's one that is going to be front and center of our minds as we get to a much higher proportion of electric vehicles on the road.
Well, you're going where I was thinking. So based on the projections, right? If I have a 2030 goal or 2050 goal or whatever it is to get my vehicle fleet electrified, if I'm going to make transportation electric, the investment, we've done episodes here. We talked about the gap from the amount of investment in renewables that need to be done to get there. And there's still quite a bit of gap, even at the pace we're going right now, to do that. So there's going to be a point where your fleet operators said, great, we want to have the renewable thing. We bought these electric vehicles for fleets, but energy may get a bit challenging or pricey or hard to come by at sometime between now and 2030. I would suspect when half the vehicles or more become all electrified based on just the numbers you were giving and the increased usage. So I wonder if that doesn't become relevant again, because if I look at even recent history with gas prices and what's been happening in the world, I mean, there's a bit more coal being burnt today than there was just a number of months ago, I believe. So
Yes.
So I wonder if that data point isn't static like you think.
I'm inclined to agree with you. The evolution, the longer term evolution of an electricity market is always an interesting thing to watch. And I spent a number of years forecasting electricity prices over an extended, time horizon. The thing that's really interesting, and this is a proper geek energy point, the thing that's really interesting about the increased penetration of renewables into the electricity system is that firstly, a lot of them are subsidized. So they're paid, they continue to get paid based on the megawatt hours they generate, as long as the price, which could be negative, is greater than the value of the certificates they're generating. So quite quickly, you've just created an artificial ecosystem whereby negative prices make sense to some electricity generators. And this is all done because we base our electricity system on a short-run marginal cost. So you get this effect whereby you get negative prices, and if you've got a truly exposed electricity price, you can basically charge your vehicle for free or get paid to charge your vehicle, as some drivers do. But in the longer term, you then go, well, hang on, how do these more expensive assets that balance the system on these cold, windless winter nights get compensated for being built in the first place? And that's where the long-run marginal cost comes in. And that long-run marginal cost is basically the amount of money that the power station needs to recover from the electricity market to enable it to justify the original capital investment. And this is why we end up with these crazy volatile prices. You get a nice windy sunny day, all the solar's generating, all the wind's blowing, the prices drop to a negative value that corresponds to the price that they're getting subsidized at. And then you go into the night, the dark, windless, cold winter night, and we get a lot of them over here in the UK. And suddenly the prices shoot back up again. because now you've got all these gas stations turning on, and firstly, it costs them money to turn on because they're running without generating to warm up. Then they're actually generating through, these evening peaks. But they're also having to recover the fact that they haven't run all day, and actually their duty cycle is really low now. So, these coal and gas stations that are still sat in our system have to recover that money in those short windows when they're required to generate. So before you know it, you've got a very volatile price system. How that's going to evolve is really interesting, but that's only half of the equation. Because even once you've generated that electricity, you need to get it to these vehicles. Now, the supply of that electricity broadly can be broken down into transmission. We've generally got lots of big fat cables laid across our countries that get that power out into the system. And then distribution. And distribution is where the fun begins, because you've got lots of vehicles spread out across towns and cities who've plugged in for the night to charge. And they may only be drawing 7 kilowatts, but each of those houses might only be rated for 1 or 2 kilowatts. So before you know it, you put a 7 kilowatt charger in someone's house and you sort of, put a massive increase, quadrupled the power demand on that house. And, in the UK, we're all single phase, so 7 kilowatts, the best we can expect. In parts of Europe, you get the 3-phase providers who can give you 22 kilowatts of power. Suddenly, you've got big chunks of power going into people's houses. And if your whole street suddenly decides they like the look of your Tesla and all get a Tesla, before you know it, that street has got an enormous power demand. And the DNO, the distribution network operator, didn't expect that. They don't know where that's come from. So how do we then use smart charging or vehicle to grid to control the impact that's going to have on the distribution system? And this is where, the real fun and games begins, because then you can get time of use tariffs that adjust people's behavior. You can get capacity tariffs that adjust people's behavior based on the impact it has on a substation. And you can really start to understand and explore how the electricity market is going to have to adapt to the rapid change of people's transport choice.
But it seems like from what you're saying that the fleet manager having control of their power at their industrial site seems like a more logical choice when you describe it this way. So it sounds great that, you're going to charge my, down in my garage here at night while I'm resting, and tomorrow morning my car's going to be charged and I'm going to go do my commercial rounds and everything's great. But, in the future that may be challenging because all my neighbors also get electric cars, and now all of a sudden there's problems with the pricing and things in my residential area. So, but I would assume the commercial or the public charging infrastructure wouldn't fall in the same unexpected growth curve, right? Because if you're putting that in, you're probably in commercial zones and probably connected differently than my house, I would assume.
Yeah, and often these commercial, either public chargers or even the sort of depot chargers that fleet managers might be considering, have to go through a slightly different process. The amount of information you provide to your distribution network operator when you install a domestic charge point is fairly limited. And the distribution network operator needs to interpret all those tiny little 7 kilowatt loads and aggregate it up and work out what that means. Whereas if you're going to go and put a couple of rapid chargers in, you might put 100 kilowatt rapid chargers in, so you get 200 kilowatts of load suddenly appearing. You're going to have to make a pretty official application to your distribution network operator. They're going to assess the impact of that on the distribution grid. And as a consequence, they're going to make sure that you've got the right amount of cabling to that location. And that costs money, which is why public charging on occasion is considered to be more expensive. But the reality is it means you've got a more robust connection in that system. Now, where it gets really interesting is on those depots where your fleet manager goes, I know, we'll put chargers in the depot. But interestingly, most of these businesses have got the optimum balance between how much electricity they need to run their business and how much connection they bought. So quite often the fleet manager then turns around and goes, you what? How much does it cost to connect these chargers? Because they've suddenly got to do a grid upgrade to bring 100, 200, 300 kilowatts of power onto their site. And that sudden surprise, this is one of I'll come back to this, but one of the things people talk about is the role of fleet managers going forward. But that surprise around the cost of building the extra grid connection suddenly puts people off some of that depot charging. But these fleet managers, they run a fleet. They're now having to learn a new technology. They're having to learn electric. The maintenance of that technology is fundamentally different. It's much more electrical. They're now having to learn about electricity. They didn't have to know about electricity previously. They're having to tackle problems with installing and operating chargers at people's houses. They didn't have to deal with people's individual houses. And on top of this, we're giving them the complexity of public charging, which we talked about earlier. So what we're doing at Paua is just trying to solve one of those pieces in this enormous puzzle that these multifaceted fleet managers are going to have to adapt to.
But do you see that becomes a problem? Maybe a little bit outside of what you guys do, but coming back to the fleet manager, because suddenly, a bit blunt, but does he care? Because big corporations has their own cost centers. His role is to make sure that we drive sustainable, and if that means an investment of something else, well, that's facility management or procurement. It's not my problem. And then suddenly we're into this catch-22 kind of a thing where as long as even the ecosystem needs to be also internally in the organization in order to make this happen.
So there's probably two parts to that. One is many of these big forward-thinking fleets have deliberately set out and given themselves some pretty challenging targets to hit. The guys at Amazon delivering electric parcels, the guys at DPD set a big ambition for how many electric towns they're going to be delivering into, and they set themselves these ambitions because it's part of their ethos and how they're servicing their customers. So that they force themselves to care and they force their teams to care. But the point that's much more interesting in here is, I believe, and generally I've been proven right, that basically humans are fundamentally lazy. If we can make things easier for ourselves, we will. And there's that lovely case study of nice Center Park, nice concrete road, turns left, nice hard corner, and everyone just walks across the corner. And the humans have created this nice, easy shortcut. We are forever finding shortcuts and simplification. So what we're trying to do for the fleet manager is make it so easy that they don't need to think. And I think what we'd like to do is make it easy for every driver. What about a world in which you have that Tesla charging experience for all drivers? The car knows where you're going to charge. The car's able to tell you whether the charge is available. You pull up, you plug in, it starts charging automatically. You can get out and get on with your day, because whilst we like talking about energy and technology, the reality is most of these future drivers we're going to see don't care. They want it to be simple.
So do you see a world then? I remember a few years back when the UK did a testing of having chargers in the road where you could charge where you're driving over the lane. I don't know if you remember this, where it was there. So you see that you'll still need to stop, and are you still looking at the world the old way? Are we still making buggy whips here by building power charging stations like gas stations, or will we solve this problem? I mean, I don't plug my smartphone anymore. I just lay it on my nightstand, right? I don't have to worry about that anymore. Why would I worry about my car anymore?
And wouldn't that be lovely to get to that point whereby by driving you're picking up enough energy by sitting in the Mario Kart lane to pick up the energy as you go over the yellow arrows, or you park in the right spot in the supermarket car park and your car charges while you shop. You don't need to plug it in, you don't need to worry about it, it just starts and everything works automatically. That is a dream.
You still have to bill, you still have the same issues because different providers would own that infrastructure. So I'm not saying everything goes away, but I just wonder if we're looking at the model from a vantage point of old technology, saying, do we really need to build the same infrastructure, or should we build a different infrastructure for EVs?
So, and this is where it gets really interesting. You're kind of talking about alternative ways of getting the power, the energy into the vehicle to enable the vehicle to get its motive force. So one of the companies which quite regularly gets referenced in this ecosystem is Better Place. Better Place was a company set up a number of years ago by in Israel, based around the idea of battery swapping. You drive down the road, you pull into a battery swapping station, you swap the batteries. And Better Place failed primarily because the automotive companies couldn't get a common view as to what a standardized approach would be. So as a consequence, there's a whole ecosystem out there of automotive companies working together or not working together. This means, consequently, that we need to get all those big players to play together. So really, without that opportunity, we're not going to get that ecosystem as seamless as we like. And the same, unfortunately, is true for wireless charging. We would need to have standardized cells, standardized vehicle layouts, a standardized approach to ensuring that the vehicle can align itself over a wireless charging pad. Now, that future might...
That happened in petrol, right? I mean, when you go, the size of the pump for a diesel is different than the gas, and it's pretty common, right? I mean, yes, it's petrol, but I mean, it did kind of happen eventually. Even though I might buy a BMW, I might buy a Ford, I might buy a Range Rover, doesn't matter. It's still the same format, right?
Yeah.
So what would keep that from happening over time as the market matures in electric?
So I believe it will happen. I think that the question is one more of timing and who it is that takes the first initiative. One of the things that I like to remind people of when we talk about this space is we are still very immature in this ecosystem. Classically, when you adopt a new technology, you talk about the S-curve of adoption. The first 2.5% is considered to be the innovators. The next sort of 12.5% is your early adopters. We're at 1% here in the UK of people driving battery electric vehicles. So we're not even halfway through the innovators step. What we need
So when
to
we
work
cross the
out,
chasm is what you're saying. We've got
a long way to go to
more.
cross the chasm, I think. But I think during that journey, one of the things we've got to be really cautious about is this point you're flagging, which is, we've got 1% of people driving, and we're drawing inferences from the way that 1% of people are using their vehicles to determine what we're going to do for the other 99%. The reality is we should look and learn from the 1% and build for the future, not build for the past. So the idea of having some form of a completely fundamentally different and rethought ecosystem for charging your vehicles, I don't think we should laugh at it. I think it's very serious. It's something that can very well happen. And there are parties out there building for it and developing it, but it's not quite been harmonized yet.
I mean, I see that if you listen to the models that talk about, maybe you won't own your car, a car is just going to be a shared resource that's out there. So it's going to need to charge, and it may not be at my house, because if my car can get 80% utilization as opposed to sitting in my driveway 90% of the time, that may be more efficient and better for the environment as well. There's an argument, right? And so, but if those models all change, and who owns the vehicle, if they're commercial or however the fleet that does that is owned, all that changes the game dramatically. And like I said, I wonder about looking at world problems from our current vantage point. Is my whole point. Now, having said that, as you said, the next 5 years, we kind of have a good idea of where we're headed. We see the roadmap, I think, of what's coming with the cars and what the automakers are trying to do and getting there. So we're starting to get up towards time. I just want to maybe switch gears a little bit and find out a little bit more about your company. So how old you are, how big you are, help us. So we had some pretty broad brushstrokes of a conversation, but tell us more about your company.
Yeah, so the original idea for this company was born when I was working at EDF Energy, and we were looking at how we could service our residential customers with a public charging solution. And we wanted to provide something that enabled them ultimately to put their cost of their public charging back onto their home electricity bill. And that was about 4 years ago. But the reality is we're a very young company. We're what David Attenborough referred to in his COP commencement speech as one of those millions of sustainable innovations that's essential to help us decarbonize. So we're one of the very early stage companies trying to put together modern solutions with the technology available to us to enable more and more drivers. So today we're only operational in the UK. We have ambitions to get beyond the UK and visit our European cousins across the water if we're still allowed to. And we're looking to service ultimately fleets, but longer term, we're hoping that we'll be able to provide this as a service to all the drivers to enable them to have more of a seamless experience. So we can offer everyone a Tesla-style charging experience.
Johan, any final thoughts?
Well, plenty. I know we're running out of time, but I got a whole list of questions. But I want to follow up a little bit on what Chris said, and we covered a lot of things around e-mobility. But one of the things that always intrigues me a little bit is that you mentioned your past and previous roles at one of the larger energy companies. You worked with something that, well, if I understand it correctly, didn't really take off there. So you actually took it and take the leap into your own. We had a similar situation not long ago in terms of a trading software where almost frustration of not being able to build it within the organization took them outside. So literally two questions on this, and I know we have a little bit of time. One, how was it to go from I wouldn't say a secure role because that's not too many left, but from a big company to actually become a startup? And how do you think this is a problem with large organizations that they work on a lot of these technologies, but really it's too slow, or worst of case, it really never materialize? And why is that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because that is kind of exactly the experience I had. I spent 15 years in large energy utilities. I went from RWE Group to British Energy to EDF Energy to SSE, and I experienced a comfortable corporate lifestyle, leading a number of different areas with the view that we were bringing innovation to life inside large utilities. So what that meant was that we were doing big things, but doing big things slowly. What I realized was, as I was going on my career path, I was trying to do the same thing again and again, which is bring a new technology to life at scale and make it happen. And it was slow. And I was reaching a point in my career where I really wanted to do something a little bit faster and do something a little bit more for myself and see if we couldn't move the dial on some of these technologies. So yeah, I did the horrible thing, which I did not enjoy doing, to answer your question, which is I went from basically having a nice, steady, stable income to having a clue where my next salary was coming from, to trying to manage a small family and trying to manage a future career path. But it was something that I had set out on in terms of a mental ambition about 10 years prior. I did an MBA, and at the end of my MBA, I was like, well, the only way I'm really going to learn how to operate and run a business is to build my own business. So I'd had that sort of desire for 10 years. I'd mentally prepared myself, and I'd spoken to enough people across the industry to know that it was going to be a horrible shock. And as I've said to a few people, it's absolutely fabulous working for yourself because you can do whatever you want. But at the same time, if something doesn't happen, it's usually because you haven't done it. So you've suddenly got this place where you are fundamentally responsible for your own well-being, and it's incredibly exciting, but also quite a challenging ecosystem to be working in.
Perfect. I admire both of you actually who've done the same kind of journey. I think it's a big task to do, but it's if you're driven by it, you have the opportunity. I think it's fantastic.
Thank you very much.
What the audience didn't get to see, because this is a podcast, is I also appreciated your daughter coming into frame for a little bit, because as a founder with young kids, I too am a founder with young kids. You are forced to succeed. You have no alternative. You just go out and you build the company and you build it the way it is. Now, fortunately, you're also probably building something that leaves her in a better place if you're successful getting the EV market, and helps leave the planet in a better place for your next generation, which should be a fun thing. I don't know if that motivates you or not, but that's what I was thinking when I saw her walking up as you were talking about starting a company. It seems like a great fit. Any final thoughts? Go ahead.
It's a big motivator for me to know that there's a small child standing behind me all the time who's going to, as other people have said, inherit this planet. And, what are we leaving for that generation? So trying to do something with my time that is meaningful is a huge part of the day-to-day motivation.
Which, like I said, that's the first thing that went through my mind, because I saw her walk into the frame, for a minute. She was very good. She was very quiet. We didn't, the audience may not have realized there was a child in the recording studio in the background behind you, but those watching on video will have seen that. But I thought that was great. But I've really enjoyed the journey, the conversation with you. I think we have a very high level of what you do. I don't know that we covered, the tip of the iceberg of all the things you do, but I think the conversation in and of itself for our audience should be intriguing. I thought it was interesting to hear your perspectives on the industry. I'm pretty sure we're going to have you back at some point to get more, because I don't think we've covered everything, and we can talk about that. But I want to thank you so much for spending some of your afternoon with us today.
No worries. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And for our audience, as I say every week, you spend another hour listening to Insider's Guide to Energy. I hope you've enjoyed the journey as much as I have. And if you have, please remember to share our episodes, get your friends to subscribe, follow us on LinkedIn. We're getting quite a number of followers there. And the more followers we get, the better the guests we can attract. So it's in your interest to keep promoting the podcast. And we look forward to talking to you again next week.